Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. If you're a yoga practitioner or teacher who knows that there's more to yoga than poses, but you're wondering where to find that, come join our quiet little party. Here you'll find resources to help you deepen your practice, as well as insightful conversations with yoga, movement, and meditation teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. So we talk about all things gentle yoga, meditation, yin, restorative, yoga therapy, mindfulness, and more. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello there, friends. Thanks for showing up for this episode of the podcast. Today, we're going to be continuing on the Bodyfulness theme, picking up from 2 episodes ago when I introduced this as our deeper dive topic for June 2022. But it's a relevant topic, I think, at any time. In that one, episode 36, I talked about the terminology, like what is bodyfulness, or what you might call embodied mindfulness, or just embodiment. And why might that be a meaningful thing to pay attention to in your practice, whether you're coming from a yoga and movement perspective or from experience with sitting meditation too. So today I want to get a little more specific on some practices and inquiries we can use to explore and support this embodied mindfulness. And speaking of which, as I mentioned, this is our current Move to Meditate Deeper Dive theme, which means that I'm sharing resources on the topic of bodyfulness all throughout this month of June. I'll be sending out a guided meditation at the end of this week, plus resending the bodyfulness worksheets, which have some of these concepts and practices written out in a fun and user-friendly format that you can refer to for ideas. These resources are free. You just have to be on my email list to get them, because that's how I send them out with my newsletters during the month. So if you want to be included on that list, just go to movetomeditate.yoga and sign up. There will also be a link to that in the show notes. And if you're listening to this like way later and it's not this week, that's pretty likely. And if you still want these resources, you can just email me and let me know. mail@movedtomeditate.com. You can get me there and I'll send it to you. I'm happy to do that. And whatever guided meditations I've done for this would be on my class library, so you can find those there. And I also wanted to take a minute to say thank you so much to those of you who've left a rating or review on the podcast lately. I've seen a few new ones in the last week, and I so appreciate your kind words. It makes me really happy, and I'm just so touched, and just to know that these conversations are interesting and helpful. And your reviews really help others to find out about the podcast. So it's a big deal. And just thank you for that and for sharing this. Okay, all right. Let's come back to the topic of embodiment, or mindfulness in the body. And I thought I'd start this today with 2 little vignettes. They're just kind of stories from my experience that I thought of when I was kind of figuring out what to say in this episode. Okay, one of them is from an experience I once had being on a camping trip in a really beautiful place in the forest, right by the ocean on the central coast of California. It's like one of the most gorgeous places ever. And I remember standing on this trail in the trees, looking at a beautiful scene and just being so excited to be there. And I'd been looking forward to this trip. And you may already know this about me, like how much I love being in nature. If you follow me on Instagram, you have seen that like half of my photos are pictures of being outside on walks and hikes. And then, another quarter is a picture of my little kitty mustache. And then the rest of them are yoga and meditation, something like that. But anyway, I love nature, and I remember standing there in this magical forest and feeling strangely kind of separate from this amazing place. There was this longing to be connected, to feel fully there, but I was aware of this kind of distance, like something was in the way. And there was nothing wrong. It was a perfectly wonderful vacation moment. But what was going on was that there was a lot of mental chatter. I was really involved in planning and thinking about things like, when are we going to get to come back here? It's so great. I'd love to return next summer. Or, ooh, I would love to bring this person here. Or, let me take a photo of this so I can show them. And where should we go hiking tomorrow? Or what should we eat tonight? And blah, 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 blah. In other words, I was kind of stuck in the mental experience of being there and not quite able to just let that quiet down so I could be present and soak in the moment. And the more I tried to grasp onto it through these thoughts and plans, the more at a distance I felt. The other little vignette I wanted to share is from the very first time I ever did yoga. I was using a yoga video with Patricia Walden because I had heard that yoga could help me relieve stress. And as a college student, I really needed that. And the postures and movements we did from the video felt great. It was really interesting and it captivated my attention. I was really into it. It was beautifully filmed video with the desert scenery and peaceful music. And I think all told it was about 20 minutes. But the part of that really hooked me was the Savasana. I remember laying on the floor there with Patricia Walden guiding a kind of a body scan, like a body part by body part relaxation, and feeling a depth of presence that I had never felt before. I had no idea you could feel that relaxed, and I had never in my head connected relaxation with the sense of aliveness and richness and fullness that it brought. And clearly, looking back on it, the asana part of the practice had prepared me for that experience of wakeful rest, the very first time I did yoga. But the stillness was where I really harvested the benefit of that. And it's safe to say that that first yoga experience still informs how and why I practice and teach today. It made such an impression. And then having a taste of that, like having had that taste of vibrant, calm, present moment awareness, I knew it was possible. And I started to notice when I wasn't that present, like on the camping trip, which was many years after that first yoga experience. But I was standing there and just missing that feeling of connection when I was on the trail, but I wasn't really totally present. And so that's still part of what motivates me to practice because I want to be there. I don't want to miss my life. And I think many of us practice, at least in part, to, quote, get out of our heads and into our bodies. We recognize the sense of imbalance or incompleteness or lack of integration when we're feeling disconnected from our visceral and embodied experience. So let's bring in this concept of bottom-up versus top-down processing, because I think this will help a little bit to explain what's going on here. These are terms that are used in psychology to theorize about how we perceive and process our internal and external experiences. And we also have both bottom-up and top-down oriented interventions or practices and different kinds of therapies that emphasize one way or the other. And you can also see it in the different kinds of movement and meditation modalities that we practice. Both bottom-up and top-down processing are essential and useful. So this is not to say that we're like doing it wrong or one is more important than the other, but that we toggle between the two all the time, and kind of having some awareness about that can sometimes be helpful. So bottom-up processing means that we are starting with sensory information, like what we can see and hear and smell and taste, or when we touch something. And then we use that sensory data to create our perceptions and meaning. Okay, so that's bottom up. Top-down processing relies more on memory and patterns that we recognize, cognitive frameworks we have, stories we have. We use that to interpret what is happening. So for example, I can look out of the window that's right here and know that there's a tree there because I've seen trees before And I recognize the pattern of a long, tall, brown thing coming out of the ground with green stuff sticking out of it. That's a tree. I don't have to really experience it through my senses and gather evidence by touching it or smelling it to know that, because I can instantly recognize the pattern through my top-down processing. I have experienced trees before, so I just recognize tree. That saves a lot of time for us humans. Can you imagine how exhausting it would be if I had to refigure out that that's a tree every day, every time when I look out of this window? But this top-down processing ability can also have its pitfalls, because our perceptions are going to be very shaped by our expectations. We're using memory and expectation kind of as a shortcut. And it kind of has an assumption embedded in it, like in a way, because it relies so much on past experience and the patterns that we've gleaned from that. So possible pitfalls of using that kind of processing. An example of the bottom-up processing, which relies more on our sensory experience, as I mentioned before. Example might be more like, oh, I'm smelling fresh pine scent, feeling a cool breeze. I'm hearing birds chirp. Oh, I realize that I must be standing in a forest. So instead of looking and kind of recognizing pattern that I just immediately label as tree, I'm taking in the smell, the feeling of the breeze, the sounds of the birds, and using that sensory data to figure it all out. And so that bottom-up process can be wonderful because it helps us to actually be more present in a lot of ways. We're relying on the real-time data and not just experiencing everything from a purely conceptual place. But we can't do that 100% of the time. It wouldn't be very efficient, right? to be like, I've never seen a forest before, and to have to like piece that together in every moment. So we use both, of course. And it's kind of about what we're referencing and in what order we're taking in the information to navigate a place or situation. So in our practice, we have techniques that are more bottom-up or body-based, and others that are more top-down or mental. Like, for example, if I get on my mat to do triangle pose, and I approach it by going through a checklist of alignment points and using my concept of how to do it right and my mental image of what it looks like. And I rely a lot on the visual assessment, like maybe I look in a mirror to see if I'm matching my mental image. That is coming from a more top-down approach. That method might give me some useful info, but it also might miss out on some possibilities. It might make some key assumptions. And then I could also approach my triangle pose a bit more by feel and kind of take the essential points of shape and setup, but pause within that framework more. Pause more for noticing sensations and using the sensations as the primary guide for how to adjust, rather than following some set rules. So in that case, I don't worry so much about how it looks or how far down I go, etc., because I'm prioritizing a more bottom-up felt sense approach. Okay, interesting. Meditation also may have elements of both top-down and bottom-up approaches too. So think about the experience of doing a body scan meditation, where you're slowly moving your attention through the body and allowing yourself to simply notice each sensation in a non-judgmental way. That's very bottom-up. Or we have other mindfulness techniques that use a more top-down approach, like when we learn to recognize and label different kinds of thoughts and mind states, right? Like, oh, this is restlessness, my mind is running around. Or, oh, this is aversion, my mind is stuck in this pushing away and not liking. Or, oh, this is wanting mind, there's craving here. I see the pattern. And that is also very important and useful. It's a huge part of the insight in insight meditation. And we might then tie those observations to an embodied sense by noticing how that thought pattern registers in the body. So we do a lot of both. We use a lot of both the top-down and the bottom-up in mindfulness meditation. One area where embodied practices of all kinds are very useful is in working with the nervous system. Movement and embodied awareness tools give us ways to skillfully intervene with states of nervous system dysregulation where it would be really difficult to think our way or talk our way out of them. Like, you know how it is when you're freaked out and someone says, calm down, take a deep breath. Usually it's not that helpful, right? You can't just talk your way or talk someone else out of a state of nervous system distress. The top-down approach doesn't always work when what you need is something that can shift your physiological state. So you need a bottom-up shift. After that shift, yes, you can probably think more clearly and communicate better and better access your top-down resources. So they're really intertwined, right? They can support one another. And okay, maybe we've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole with these terms, but the point is that we can use the body to help ground the busyness or intensity of the mind, and we can use the mind to understand and make sense of all the patterns that are occurring and to see more clearly and to turn our experiences into wisdom. Most of us are very familiar with and very habituated to using the thinking mind to solve problems, or to try to resolve stress by thinking of a plan, or to soothe ourselves by thinking good thoughts. And what we tend to need more practice on is the bodyfulness dimension. It's less familiar for so many of us. We have less training on this. And this is the bodyfulness dimension is where we are rooted in the present moment through our embodied sensory experience. So I'm going to offer some practice suggestions for this to enhance bodyfulness. So in meditation practice, when you're sitting in meditation or laying on the floor in meditation, you can work with the body scan technique that I mentioned above. And there's different variations of it that may suit you better on a different day. You can, even within the body scan, maybe play with incorporating touch a little bit. Like one thing I do sometimes is just put my hand on different parts of the body as I go. So maybe I'm just slowly taking my hand down my arm as I'm taking my attention down my arm, because that tactile sense, that touch, can really help us to connect and start to sense the body a little more clearly. So I would also suggest walking meditation as a great embodied meditation practice, because it very much engages our senses. It's very much in that bottom-up realm. You feel your feet lifting and then touching the ground. You feel your leg muscles contracting and balancing you. And you can notice that you're seeing things as you're moving, you're hearing sounds in the environment. All of this while cultivating this simple meditative presence. Mindful movement practice, of course, including yoga, can be enormously helpful if we're doing it in a way that cultivates present moment sensory awareness, which means we're not powering through a physical practice or being overly heady and technical about it. So on this journey of re-inhabiting the body, you might find it necessary to start in the beginning of re-inhabiting, to start with grosser or bigger movements and higher intensity sensations within reason and within safety in order to feel, especially if you feel a little disconnected or numb, to start with bigger movements and a little more kind of sensation, and then slowly over time to move towards more and more subtle movements, subtler sensations, to noticing quieter things as your ability to track those subtler, quieter sensations grows. So when we're just starting out and our awareness is brand new to this, it's hard for it to really pick up on things that are quiet and subtle. It needs a little bit more stimulation, and over time we can bring our awareness down to levels of subtlety. And then sensations you can pay attention to could include the feeling of effort, like feel the effort in your quads when you're in chair pose, or sensations of stretch, like you're doing a forward fold and feeling the stretch, the lengthening in your hamstrings. You could notice sensations of warmth, coolness, changes in the breath rate as your breath slows down or it picks up because of effort. And you can also use things like props or roll on some massage balls, use self-touch, things like that give yourself some tactile feedback and that help you learn to recognize and increase the recognition of signals from the body. So you just start to notice them. They're happening, but we're not necessarily always listening. We learn to listen. And you might start by paying attention to parts of the body that have a lot of nerve endings, like your hands and feet, because they might be easier to feel. There's a lot of sensation there to be felt. It's sometimes easier to feel like some of those kind of tingly, vibrating feelings in the hands and feet because there's just a lot of nerve activity there. Don't start with areas in the body that you associate with pain or injury or trauma, because you need to build some of these embodied mindfulness and compassion skills, and it's harder to learn the skills with areas that are more distressed, right? And on that note, if you haven't already, I would also recommend listening to episode 33, a few episodes back, which is an interview that I did with Amanda Hanna. And we talked about yin yoga and embodiment. And there's a lot in there about how to navigate the re-embodiment process when there's more emotional charge or a history of trauma. So just as a side note to check that one out if you haven't. As you're practicing as well, not just in meditation, but in yoga, you might want to experiment with practicing with your eyes closed at times and your eyes open at other times. And also to avoid, especially in yoga and movement practice, avoid looking in the mirror for a while. If you practice in an environment where there's a mirror, or if you practice on Zoom, can you try not to stare at yourself on the screen? At least for a while. And I know a lot of yoga studios consider the mirror to be like a really standard part of how they practice and how they teach and how they cue. And I'm not saying that you can never use a mirror or that it's never useful, but for purposes of embodiment, just play with it for a while and notice the difference in where your attention goes and what you feel when you're looking in a mirror and when you're not. Just to see if, kind of taking your attention out of the visual and a little more internal, if that makes a difference in your bodyfulness. And then lastly, remember that it's very normal to be able to feel some parts of the body more clearly than others. We all have parts of the body that are really easy to feel and others that it's kind of like a blank place on the map or it's kind of dormant. It does change over time as you develop a relationship with the body, but don't make a problem out of it. Don't make a huge project out of it if there's a part of the body it's kind of dormant. It might be totally different tomorrow. So be patient and remember that embodiment or re-embodiment is a process. And bodyfulness is a lifelong practice. And it's really worthwhile for those of us who want to show up for our lives fully and to live with presence. So I thank you very much for listening to this episode, and I hope you found something useful in this reflection about bodyfulness and the concept of bottom-up versus top-down processing. I would love to hear what your takeaways are. You can always email me at movetomeditate.yoga on my website. Send me an email through there, or find me on Instagram at @_movedtomeditate. And while you're there on the website, movetomeditate.yoga, don't forget to sign up for the email newsletter if you want the additional resources on bodyfulness. So that's it for now. Be well until next time. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend and/or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find us that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, live online classes, teacher trainings, and private lessons, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. Thanks so much for listening.